My name is Adrian Moore, Vice President here at the Reason Foundation, and welcome to all of you. Thank you for attending. Today we're going to hear from Shikha Dalmia, who has worked on immigration issues, writing about it for as long as I've known her, which is over a decade, and she's actually been very prolific on this issue lately, not only covering sort of the developments that have been going on out there, but also developing and exploring some ideas for how to address our immigration problems. And we're going to focus on a lot of that today. Okay, with that, Shikha, why don't you go ahead and take it over?
Thanks a lot, Adrian, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. As Adrian mentioned, I've been covering immigration for a long time, actually 2 decades. And although immigration has always been a difficult issue, I have actually never seen the debate turn this hostile and this ugly. And our immigration system is totally broken. Yet immigration reform right now is totally dead in the water for the foreseeable and even actually the unforeseeable future. And the main reason is that no one trusts Washington. And there is actually good reason for that. Ever since Washington moved away from essentially an open borders policy, which was till the early 20th century, and started engaging in what I call as this Leninist-style centralized planning of immigration flows, it has made a complete hash of things. Now, to see how big a hash of things it has made, consider the gap in the demand for foreign workers in various sectors of the economy and the supply that Washington bureaucrats allow. These bureaucrats have basically divided foreign workers into 2 broad and crude categories, skilled and unskilled workers. Every kind of work classification has to be somehow shoehorned into these 2 categories. So masons and welders who are generally regarded as skilled trades, for the purposes of our immigration policies are regarded as unskilled trades, and masseurs are treated as skilled trades. Not only is the skilled-unskilled distinction arbitrary, but it is actually also economically meaningless because, as far as employers are concerned, the relevant distinction is between workers who help them generate value and profits and those who don't. But Washington's bureaucrats impose their own hierarchies and privileged high-skilled workers over unskilled ones, and then they give very poor treatment to the skilled workers, and what I say is the bureaucratic equivalent of waterboarding to the unskilled workers. Every year, the federal government hands out 85,000 H-1B visas to foreign techies or STEM graduates. But last year, in the first week that this visa became available, employers filed 125,000 petitions, at which point the Fed simply stopped accepting more applications. And this is what it does every year. So that represents, conservatively speaking, a gap of about 40,000. The actual demand is actually a lot more. A lot of employers don't bother applying because it's not worth it. The visa lottery, the odds are against them in this visa lottery. Now, as for the low-skilled workers, in theory, there are 2 visa programs that they can use to legally work in the United States. Agricultural workers can use the so-called H-2A visas. Officially now, unlike the H-1B visas, there's no cap on H-2A visas. But the problem here is that the requirements and the red tape is so onerous that they are literally useless. Washington hands out about 75,000 of these visas annually, and they cover about 10% of farm jobs. About 55% of farm workers are estimated to be working without any legal status, and so this works out to about 412,000 illegals every year. For non-agricultural seasonal workers, they need something called H-2B visas. The annual cap on these visas is 66,000, and employers filed 300,000 petitions in 2008, which was actually a down year, which represents a gap of 244,000. Now, the big difference between the high-tech H-1B visas and these low-skilled H-2A and H-2B visas is that H-1B visas are actually gateways to green cards because they allow their holders to apply for permanent residency in the United States. But the unskilled visas, H-2A and H-2B, are non-immigrant visas, and they don't open the door to a green card. They can be renewed for some limited number of years, but after that, their holders are out of luck. There is no process they can follow, no line they can wait in to get a green card, which is why so many of them end up living here illegally. So when you hear restrictionists say that, well, these people should go and wait in a line, the key thing to remember is that there is no line for these people to wait in. So in effect, Washington's handling of immigration policies is designed to breed shortages or lawlessness or both. But none of the reform proposals currently on the table in Congress would deal with these fundamental problems. The Senate bill that is going nowhere fast would raise some visa caps, but would create so much more red tape in other ways that it hasn't generated much enthusiasm from the industries that are supposed to be helped by it. On the other hand, it has not changed the incentives for lawlessness enough to mute the opposition of states like Arizona. Now, my contention is that the one way to change all this would be by federalizing America's immigration system. And at first, this sounds like a completely crazy idea till you consider that our neighbors to the north, Canada, has been doing this for actually over 2 decades now through something called the Provincial Nominee Program. The economic advantage of this program is that it is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It allows states far greater flexibility to recruit foreigners who meet their particular local labor needs rather than when distant federal bureaucrats call the shots. So no longer, for instance, as in America, would Cupertino's, California's needs for STEM graduates be prioritized over, say, Florida's needs for farmhands. The political advantage of this program is that it would direct immigrants to states that want them while keeping them away from those that don't, thereby not allowing the most hostile state to set the policy for all. But before I get into the advantages of this program, let me describe how it works in Canada. And I'm going to do this in very, very broad brush strokes, and you can ask me more questions later on. Before Canada embraced the PNP program, as it's called, it admitted all immigrants based on a federal point system developed in Ottawa. Immigrants would be rated based on their education, skills, age, linguistic abilities, and those who got the requisite points would be admitted and others would be rejected. This system was always more open than ours, but the problem it shared with ours was that it bred a mismatch between the labor needs of local economies and the foreign workers admitted. It was not uncommon to find Russian cab drivers in Toronto with PhD in physics. Under Canada's provincial nominee program now, what Ottawa has started doing is that it gives the 13 provincial entities a quota to sponsor permanent residents, not temporary visas, mind you, but actual long-term permanent residents. With some restrictions, each province can fill its quota with whoever it wants for almost any reason it wants, in effect write its own immigration policy. Provinces can pick applicants left over from the federal point program. They can also solicit applicants from anywhere in the world. In a direct attempt to poach talent from the United States, some provinces are sponsoring H-1B holders stuck in America's labyrinth green card program. The government in Ottawa can't question either the province's criteria or their methods of recruitment. Its role is limited to conducting a security, criminal, and a health check on foreigners picked by the provinces, which has cut the processing time for green cards to 1 or 2 years compared to five years to a decade in the United States. Now, the program gives British Columbia the same flexibility to sponsor, say, bricklayers as it gives Ontario to sponsor computer programmers. It doesn't treat the entire Canadian economy as monolithic and pretend that it can effectively plot the job market or the labor market for the whole country. The program has been such a huge success that provinces are now demanding that Ottawa raise its provincial quotas or scrap them altogether. Some provinces have struggled with retention rates, But on average, provinces have managed to hang on to 70% of their foreign recruits, and for the simple reason is that there is such a close matching between the labor needs of the economy and the skills of the foreigners that, once the foreigners get there, they don't feel any need to go anywhere else. Now, the economic advantages, this very granular matching of foreigners to local labor needs is kind of obvious enough. But I'm going to lay out 5 other non-economic advantages that are actually even more important from the United States standpoint. The first one is that states this would allow the states to solve the illegal immigration problem, which has been such a deal breaker over here, through mutual cooperation. One reason that immigration reform has stalled in Congress is this vehement disagreement about what to do about the undocumented population. Everyone knows that about Arizona's vociferous opposition to undocumented workers and its efforts, draconian efforts, some would say, to get rid of the undocumented population. But what's not so well known is that Arizona's neighbor, Utah, wants these undocumented workers, and for over 3 years has been asking Congress to give it a waiver to carry out a more immigrant and employer-friendly program. Basically, Utah wants to offer legal residency to guest workers if they submit to a background check, pay a fine, and demonstrate a degree of English proficiency. But the Obama administration, even as it condemns Arizona's draconian tactics to get rid of its undocumented people, hasn't yet consented to Utah's request. Now, in a federalized approach where each state had more say in setting its own immigration policy, the illegal problem could solve itself through mutual cooperation between the states. Utah's residents could sponsor Arizona's illegals, taking them off Arizona's hands, allowing both states to get their preferred outcome. The second advantage of this program would be that it would change the incentives so that states would start treating immigrants as assets that they want and not liabilities that have to be shunned. One of the most striking aspects about the immigration debate in Canada and America is their contrasting tone towards foreigners. In America, the land of immigrants, ironically, foreigners are regarded as foes who are treated with suspicion, not as friends who should be welcomed with open arms. The entire conversation is dominated by those who advocate crackdowns, e-verify, barbed wire fences, self-deportation, etc., etc. In Canada, however, the focus is on how do we recruit the people we want. While America is building fences, Canadian provinces are dispatching recruiters all over the world, selling their provinces to prospective residents, kind of like companies do on college campuses. The beauty of the PNP program is that it hasn't made provinces foreigner-friendly by singing John Lennon's Imagine to them. It's done so by giving provinces more control over their immigration policy and thereby changing their incentive structure. Provinces are certainly free to turn away immigrants if they don't want them, but doing so comes with an economic price because businesses are likely to locate to places where labor is more plentiful. This will mean loss of jobs, tax revenues, population, etc. Because provinces can control immigration flows so as to avoid strain on their public goods, there is no downside to immigration, only an upside. Hence, they compete with each other to spread out the welcome mat rather than demand that the federal government build more walls on the border. By contrast, in America, if a state can get Uncle Sam to restrict immigration, it doesn't give up a competitive edge because no one else can get foreigners either. So it's kind of like a lose-lose zero-sum game in which everybody is loser, but because nobody can be a winner, states engage in this kind of a lose-lose game. Now, the third advantage of this program would be that it would allow states to use immigrants to fill whatever existential vacuum they feel exists in their midst. In America, various factions are always warring at the federal level as to what exactly the purpose of immigration policy is. Some believe that immigrants should be recruited to fill some targeted economic need. Others advocate a strong focus on family reunification in order to strengthen and honor America's commitment to the institution of the family. Under a more federalized system, each state can decide for itself. In Canada, some provinces do recruit from areas with whom they want to strengthen cultural or ethnic ties, not for economic reasons, although ultimately I believe, the economic motive is the most powerful motive and there's no getting around it, and that's what most states would use if they were left to their own devices. The fourth advantage of such a system would be that it would turn states into laboratories of democracy on immigration policy. Now, if you've been covering immigration for as long as I have, you know that yet another study on whether immigrants complement native skills or compete with them, create or cost native jobs, et cetera, won't settle this debate. The evidence that scientific studies produce, while important, always has and always will be contested when policy is based on it, especially when the stakes are as high and people can't opt out of Washington cooks up for them. A federalized system will allow each state to field test its own hunch. And if very comparable states such as Utah or Arizona opt for widely different immigration approaches, we'll get something resembling a controlled lab experiment in the real world whose results will be instructive for everyone. I would imagine that over time, immigration policies of various states would converge as states voluntarily emulate the lessons of their more successful peers. It might take many decades for this to play out, but the end result will be achieved with relatively little acrimony than if the federal government were to try and impose the same solution top-down. Now, that's how it is actually played out in another area, the right to work issue. After the federal government enacted the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, allowing states to opt out of closed shop arrangements, southern states became right to work, while northern states opted to remain union shops. In right to work states, unions can't forcibly extract dues from workers as a condition of employment. This considerably weakens the hold of unions in the workplace. And because it has weakened the hold of unions in southern states, manufacturing and industry have located south to take advantage of that more hospitable business environment. The result is now northern states have started to rethink their pro-union policies. Now, even Michigan, where I live, the union stronghold has now been weakened enough that Michigan has become a right-to-work state, the 23rd in the union. If a federalized approach worked in manufacturing industry, it can also work in labor markets. Now, the fifth and the final reason a federalized approach would be a good thing is that it would put Uncle Sam in a limited and confined space, which is where we want it. The program, the provincial nominee or a federalized program is in some ways much more in tune with the spirit of true federalism. Provinces and states have a natural interest in their economies and the federal government in national security. Canada divides the federal and the provincial roles in accordance with the primary interests of each of these entities, ensuring a proper balancing of both. So you don't have the federal government trying to balance all the concerns. Each side takes care of its own end of concerns. Canada's provincial nominee program, therefore, lives up to American principles of limited government and liberty, and of course, the lore of America as a nation of immigrants far more than actually America does.
Well, thank you very much, Shikha. That was a good overview, and I think even though I thought I was pretty familiar with the Canadian system, I think you made some good points about some of the benefits, the non-economic benefits, and the economic ones that get talked about the most. So we have several questions already in the queue. Let me, Shikha, someone asked, why do people think that there is a line that unskilled workers can get in order to immigrate into this country, even people who ought to know how the systems work, like members of Congress?
I just think that immigration policy is so complicated that nobody, even though I've been writing about it for 20 years, I don't fully understand it. I think the reason that people think that there's a line for unskilled workers is because there is a line for skilled workers, and they just assume that the same process must apply to unskilled workers. So for skilled workers, as I said, when they go on an H-1B, they can simultaneously apply for a green card. It's allowed under their visa rules to do so. For unskilled workers, H-2A and H-2B visas, actually, if the immigration officer who is handing out the visa, when you apply for the visa, gets wind that you have any intention of staying in the United States, they actually sort of blacklist you. So, so if you get these visas, in some ways, you make it even more difficult to apply for a green card unless you have some kind of a family member or something who's willing to sponsor you under the family reunification quota or something like that. So I just think that there is a huge misunderstanding about this.
Okay, thanks. The next question is, have the efforts of Zuckerberg and others who've tried to increase technical immigrants had any impact towards having better policy?
Yeah, all the Silicon Valley companies, Bill Gates, Zuckerberg, all of them have been appealing to Congress for many years now to increase the quota of STEM workers and, the H-1B visa quota. Also, the green card, I didn't get into this. The other big problem for high-skilled immigrants is that their green cards, especially for, folks from countries like India and China, take almost like 15 to 18 years these days to process. And the reason is that for green cards, there's a country-wide quota. So no country can get more than 7% of the annual green cards that the United States handed out. But if some country doesn't, if the quota is not filled, that doesn't mean another country gets it. It still has to stay within the 7% quota. But because there are so many demand for Chinese and Indian engineers and STEM workers is so high, it's been building up over time, and now the backlog extends to 12 years. This has been a huge problem for Silicon Valley, because so long as you are in the process of getting a green card, you can't change employers. You are stuck with the same employer. So not only aren't there enough people coming in to the system, once they get into the system, they're kind of frozen, and companies can't really bid them away. And so Silicon Valley has been asking for reform for a very long time. And there are a lot of, the skilled program is actually, I think there's the greatest consensus about that. And most people in Congress actually agree that, we need to do something about skilled workers. The problem right now is a political one, which is that Democrats want comprehensive immigration reform because they feel if the skilled, if they give high-tech companies what they want on skilled workers, they're basically the undocumented population will be left out in the cold. There'll never be any political momentum to do anything about them because of the whole, opposition to amnesty. So they want to tie the two together. So if they could disaggregate these bills, I think we could get action on the skilled worker program because of efforts like Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, but it seems politically difficult right now.
All right, thanks. The next question is, shouldn't libertarians, constitutional conservatives, and progressives, all concerned about civil liberties, reject any immigration reform proposal that includes universal or mandatory E-Verify or any other type of real ID or national ID card?
I have a lot of sympathy for that. And, that's one reason I have not been able to actually support the Senate bill, the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill that was proposed last year. I have also not supported Bush's 2006 proposal for the same reasons. I think the opening of the border would be so minimal compared to the draconian civil rights abrogations that would be unleashed in the country that I personally find it very difficult to support these kinds of programs. So, yeah, I kind of agree with that.
Okay. How strong is the resistance from unions to immigration reform, and what impact has that had in the debate?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. Unions have actually evolved kind of interestingly on this whole question. The United States used to have the Barcero program with Mexico, which was essentially a guest worker program, which was working great. It allowed a lot of Mexicans to come and temporarily work in the country, when their labor was needed, and then return and then get the visa again to come back. Once we ended this program, this cyclical population became a permanent illegal population in the United States. And the reason the Barcero program was killed was because of union opposition. They just didn't like competition from cheap labor. Since then, actually, because of the plummeting membership of unions, the SEIU, the Service Employee International Union, long ago actually started supporting more pro-immigration policies because they see foreign workers as a way to increase their memberships in the service industry, hotels where you have Mexican cleaning staff and what have you. AFL-CIO had actually been opposed to it so far, but even they have kind of backed off on their opposition, at least on the face of it. What they have tried to do is write these reform bills in such a way to make labor certification difficult, but they are not actually opposing immigration reform. So labor is kind of like, it's not really as big a problem in my view as some of the, right-wing restrictionists are right now.
Thanks. The next question is, with your idea, your federalizing idea, and this alignment of states sort of taking more responsibility for all these decisions, would that cause beefed up border security between states? Could you imagine a scenario like that?
Not really, because, immigrants, there are various proposals that are out there. After actually I wrote this piece, on Canada's immigration system for Bloomberg, New York University's Next City, their magazine, did a long feature that came out of this piece, and then Cato Institute actually commissioned a study to see how this program would be operationalized in the United States. So in Canada, there are no restrictions between states. Immigrants can go wherever they want to. So Newfoundland can recruit an immigrant and can use it to Ontario. They haven't generally, that hasn't generally happened because as I said in my talk, that the matching of the labor skills and the labor markets is so good that people don't generally tend to feel the need to move out. The proposal that Cato has put out would actually require immigrants to stay in their sponsoring state for 6 to 7 years, and other states would not be able to actually hire these immigrants, or these immigrants wouldn't be able to go to other states. So that would take care of, I'm not crazy about that idea, but, if there were a concern, it could be handled that way. But I think over time, a dynamic would emerge where the advantages of this, of these immigrants would be so great that I think there would be competition for them rather than fences against them.
Okay. Yeah, I think actually the next question was about, would immigrants be required only to remain in the state that recruited them? I think, that's what you just addressed there. That does create some trade-off. Another question is, isn't a big part of the problem that many people don't think we should even be allowing unskilled workers into the country, that it's only skilled workers that we want as immigrants?
Right. That is actually a huge problem. Here in America, we have this credentialism fetish. Like we somehow, America is preoccupied with trying to figure out who the next, Vinod Khosla is going to be, or, the next new, the guy who started Google, I forget his name. That's kind of what America's immigration policy is fixated on finding the next great genius from, from foreigners. But that's not actually, if you think about it, that's not how economies run. Economies run because their workers are positioned in such a way that you can get the maximum value out of them. It allows companies to allocate their resources in the most cost-effective manner and become competitive. That's how the everyday economy works. So, we have this credentialist fetish in the United States, which in my view is completely misguided. I think employers should decide which kind of workers they want and how many of them they want. Maybe they want absolute geniuses, or maybe they just want farmhands. That's for them to decide. They are best placed to make that decision.
Okay. Given the intensity of the current, crisis and all the undocumented children crossing the border and everything that's happened in the last couple of months, what would be the first step in the idea that you propose? And is it something that would address the current crisis, or is this a longer-term solution?
The provincial program, I am basically addressing the economic aspect of our immigration system, or the economic immigrants that we want, but there is no reason why we actually can't broaden this. For instance, you could potentially give states complete freedom to decide who they want. They can, in Canada, this is not quite allowed, which is sponsoring refugees who are trying to flee political persecution in other countries. That's still a role for Ottawa. But in principle, there is no reason why states can't take it upon themselves to sponsor, refugees through asylum policy. So in other words, you federalize asylum laws as well. I don't see why that can't be done. In fact, in a limited way, that was done in Minnesota some years ago, where Minnesota got a special waiver from the federal government to sponsor immigrants from, I forget which African country it was, but it was facing a lot of civil unrest. And it brought thousands of people from there, and they've actually been very successfully integrated in the local economy.
Sort of a closely related question is, how would this, the transition to the approach you're talking about affect the secure the borders first mantra that a lot of conservatives have? And, first stop the flow of illegals, then figure out the plan, and then start allowing immigration, is essentially how they put it.
Right. It is such a misguided call. If it means that we've got to put up fences and control strong enough to actually stop the flow of immigrants coming into this country. In my view, the best border control strategy is a very liberal guest worker program that gives people legal means to come to this country so that they don't have to come here illegally. I don't think any border enforcement approach is really going to work until we open legal avenues through a very, very, generous guest worker program. So in some ways, this federalized approach, which allows states, to decide to offer these kinds of legal avenues, I think that kind of automatically would stem the need for illegal immigrants, and, it would deal with the problem that way. But, this has become such a trope, and people have become so fixated on this that it is hard to see how you break through it with rational proposals.
Okay, thanks. And then the last question is, how serious are efforts to tie liberalizing immigration with tightening up on various forms of welfare and safety net benefits?
Well, already immigrants are not allowed any of the food aid programs or Medicaid programs or what have you. The only thing they are allowed to get, even when they are legal, is emergency Medicaid. Other than that, they are not allowed, most forms of welfare. Now, some states might be a little bit more generous, but federally, that's how it works. Look, I just think this has always been something of a bogus issue. Look, immigrants come over here at the peak years of their working years. they are already educated, or, the time when they're actually a liability on society where, they have to be fed, clothed, nourished, what have you, has already been spent in their home countries. Now they're coming in their peak working years. They work, they generate taxes, and they make massive economic contributions. I mean, most studies out there show that their economic contributions and their tax contributions far outweigh whatever little they collect on from welfare and what have you. So, this is just kind of like a red herring, and it's a bogus issue. But, we have policies that prevent them from collecting welfare already. I don't see why we need to strengthen them any further.
Yeah, I think the optics are very different. You don't see on anywhere images or stories about illegal immigrants who come here, who are, like you say, in their 20s, already educated, in the prime of their working lives. What you see are uneducated, largely unskilled Latin America immigrants with children. And having lived on a border state for almost my entire life, there's an endless flow of news. There isn't a day without news, without these folks relying upon lots of these kinds of social services. So the data may show that overall immigrants are as you described, but the day-to-day life of people on border states is very different from that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's true. Border states, I think, do face a genuine issue compared to a lot of other states. I think at that level, and that's kind of, if there is any legitimate, reason to oppose immigration, or like a kernel of truth in what the restrictions are saying, it is exactly that. You get a flood of immigrants who come to border states, and they strain their services and the public goods, much more and very quickly. And I understand that, which is why I think a federalized approach would work so much better, where our states actually control their flows. They know how many immigrants they can actually accept and how many they can assimilate without overstraining their public services, their social services. So that would be an advantage of a system like that. But even Adrian, even with uneducated, unskilled workers, if you look at the numbers, their use of welfare is much, much lower than the native population, partly because they are not allowed, partly they just don't know how. So even if they are coming with children, and even if they are coming with families, their drain on the system is actually not all that great. And one other last thing to add, Brian Kaplan of George Mason University has pointed out that actually, if you have immigration from ethnically different countries, actually over time erodes support for the welfare state, for the simple reason that, you don't want to give welfare to people who don't look like you. So from a libertarian standpoint, if you don't like the welfare state, in a way, an ethnically diverse population that more foreigners, immigration would bring, would be a way to actually cure the problem of the welfare state rather than, strain the welfare state.
All right. Well, we've reached the end of our time. I want to again thank everyone for attending and remind you that this is a monthly event. We have different topics each month. You should be getting invites each month. We are trying to put together occasionally extra telebriefings on hot topics. We may be putting one on very soon on militarization of police, given the events in Ferguson, and you'll get an invite to that as it comes together. So keep your eye out for that. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you all on the next call.